everyone, and welcome to Inspiring Generations. I'm Dr. Jennifer Colito. We are so happy that you joined us here today for our podcast and video podcast. And today we're going to be talking with Josie McRoberts, who's joining us again to talk about permanent school closures due to COVID-19 pandemic article that she wrote. So we're going to bring her on up here. Josie, thank you so much for joining us again. You have been a busy lady this summer writing all these articles, and it is absolutely fantastic because you are truly contributing so much to education and just disseminating knowledge, right, in the research that we've done. So I do want to personally acknowledge that, and thank you so much for all your hard work. So I'm excited to talk about this because these permanent school closures, because I have worked both in private and public schools. Public schools are always going to have funding, right? But these private schools that are really at the core and heart of some people's personal and religious beliefs and values are really at risk. And we've already seen it. And I've, gone back and touched base with some of the schools that I've worked at and the struggles really that they are having. So let's just go ahead and dive right into it and start out, obviously, at the onset of it. If you're not working, you don't have money, you can't pay for private education. So these schools are losing enrollment. So tell us a little bit more about that.
So with COVID, schools moved from obviously in-person learning to online learning. And I mean, the pandemic has really taken a toll on everything within our lives. So it's totally understandable that families don't want to continue to pay tuition for online learning and would rather just unenroll for the year or take time off or take a gap year. And so these institutions lose a lot of their funding this way.
And there are, I think you had mentioned at the time that you wrote the article, beginning of July 2021, there are about 132 closures just to mainly low-cost private schools that were closing, correct?
Yeah.
So, and that's really difficult that families have to make that decision. I know for me as a parent, I had my kids in private school, and it was really important that they got not only their education, but their education from a religious viewpoint as well.
Yes, absolutely.
So with that, obviously declining enrollment, it's kind of touched on this a little bit, is the financial strains, right, that the schools are experiencing. So talk us through a little bit about what you discovered in your research.
Well, basically, as people are unenrolling or taking time off from school, that adds to already existing financial strain for a lot of these schools, but also the pandemic caused a lot more economic issues for these schools with costs and cleaning costs and basically paying teachers during this awful time. And so these schools have just faced a lot more financial problems than kind of is seen to the eye.
And it's not just K through 12, it is universities as well, right?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you saw with some of those smaller universities, what was happening.
Well, recently there's been a shift away from smaller rural colleges with, maybe 1,300 kids to big state schools or schools in cities. So those are the schools that have probably been hit the hardest with COVID. They've already had some trouble trying to get students to go there. And then with COVID, just an added issue. It's really hard for these schools to keep their doors open.
Yeah, and I remember not so long ago, at least in Illinois, there was some huge issues with some of these state universities possibly losing funding, right, and having enrollment and financial issues. And now with these smaller universities closing, there may be those opportunities to have more sustainable growth and enrollment in some of these state universities, but it's at the cost, again, of these smaller universities where you get more personalized attention with your instructors. you gain a closer, tight-knit community. Not to say that that's not there in bigger universities, but some people go to these smaller universities just for that. So that's very disheartening as well. But there's also a historical precedence for this. So tell us a little bit about what you found in relation to that.
Yeah, one thing that I found that was super interesting was that many of the schools that did end up closing from due to COVID had survived throughout the world wars, the Great Depression, natural disasters, and still had been able to keep their doors open. But ultimately, it was the kiss of death for them. And it's really sad because with each loss of these schools, there's a loss of communities, family values, a loss of tradition, and really just a lot of displacement for the educators and students.
Yeah, it's just so interesting when we think about, just as you said, how some of these universities have survived some really horrific things within history, but at the same time, COVID was like you said, the kiss of death. That was the thing that really just like the doors are shutting.
Yeah.
And it's when we think about it in that perspective, we can appreciate the gravity and the severity of what this pandemic has really done. It's something that we have not lived, several generations have not lived through, right? I know my grandmother, who, God rest her soul, she passed away, but she lived through the Great Depression, right? She experienced that. But a lot of those older generations who have lived through that, unfortunately, are no longer around. And this is like the big thing for our generation that we are living through and trying to make sense of. So with that, permanent school closures, there's a lot of alternative teaching environments or learning environments that are coming up with micro schools and cottage schools that I would implore all of our listeners to go ahead and check out as schools are closing. If you're a teacher, there are other options out there for you. And a lot of families are wanting to hire teachers to homeschool. I know that was something that I did this past year because the family just was not comfortable sending their kids to school. And so we just need to be on the forefront for educators, be on the forefront of what exactly is taking place and make sure that we can continue doing what we love to do, and that is teaching students. So with that, Josie, thank you so much again for joining us today on Inspiring Generations broadcast. I know we're going to be bringing you back very, very soon for another article to discuss, and we hope all of our listeners are enjoying all these wonderful articles that you have been writing. We encourage everyone to go out to euc2experience.org/blog and check out this article, Permanent School Closures Due to COVID-19 Pandemic. So with that, Josie, thank you so much for joining us. It was awesome having you. And for all of our listeners, make sure you go out and check our blog as well as the other podcasts that we have out. And we look forward to communicating you and following up on any comments that you guys have. Take care.